The fantasy playoffs are quickly approaching, and there's 5 things you should be doing to improve your team before the playoffs. Let's discuss. Now, the first thing you want to do is add Jelani Woods, who's the Colts rookie tight end, because it's rare you find a serviceable tight end in week 13 on the waiver wires heading into the playoffs, let alone a rookie tight end. But that's exactly what's happening with Woods right now after having a breakout game on Monday Night Football. And according to Sleeper, Woods is only rostered in 7% of leagues, so he's available in 93% of leagues, and if you play on Yahoo, he's available in over 95% of leagues. Now, Woods is a rookie 3rd round pick, and he's one of the most athletic tight ends of all time. He's a freak. This is this dude's workout metrics. These bars, when it goes up to 94th percentile, rarely for a tight end are one of these bars high. All of his are high. He has legit top 5% speed, top 5% burst and catch radius, and his size, that size is crazy. He's 6'7", over 250 pounds, and he still has the speed, agility, and burst. It makes no sense to me. The dude's just a unicorn, and this past week he saw a season high 61% snaps. He had 98 yards on 9 targets. He was actually the tight end 2 on the entire week, and he did it. The only guy who scored more than him was Dalton Schultz, who took 2 touchdowns to get there for Schultz. Jelani Woods, no touchdowns, just puts up pure targets, yards after the catch. He looked great out there. He looked huge out there. Now, a big reason why his usage increased was Kyle Granson, one of the other 3 tight ends that have been worked in this season. Well, he missed this game. He was inactive in week 12, but now the genie's out of the bottle with this rookie athletic freak. Maybe they go back to some rotation, but he by far and away played 66% of the snaps, pushed a veteran Mo Alley Cox to the bench. I think he can push a guy like Kyle Granson to the bench. It's at least worth adding him heading into the playoffs for a potential top 5, top tight end down the stretch. And if you need even more convincing to just take a stab on him, his rest of season schedule is amazing. The Colts tight ends, which Jelani Woods is one of them, have the best fantasy playoff schedule amongst all tight ends, the easiest schedule, which includes a matchup against the Giants, who give up the 3rd most yards to tight ends. So go get Jelani Woods and then make sure you're picking up high upside handcuff RBs. And we can start with Zamir White, who is the backup in Las Vegas for Josh Jacobs. And we all know how great Jacobs has been. He just scored 50 fantasy points. He literally has the best opportunity share, meaning his total backfield touches and targets in the NFL, seeing 83% of them. Now, despite this, Zamir White is available in over 90% of leagues, meaning that if something happened to Jacobs, White's going to step in, and he's on the waiver wire everywhere, so go get him. And if you're not familiar with White, he has fantastic speed and burst, top 5% speed of all time, and burst is what you're seeing right here. And this 4th round rookie averaged over 5.5 yards per touch in college. He never had a massive 1,500-yard season because he had a couple of knee injuries that cut his season short. Now, in week 12, when Josh Jacobs was going absolutely bananas, it was actually Amir Abdullah who saw the most backup snaps. 14 backup snaps to Zamir White's just 3. So you might be saying, Sal, isn't Abdullah the backup? Well, Abdullah has a specific role. He'll play on some of the 3rd downs, whereas Zamir White is an early down back. He has the size of 215 pounds to also be the red zone back if something happened to Jacobs. So stash Zamir White, especially if you're a Jacobs owner, because this specific week, Jacobs isn't even practicing all week with injury. And then add the Eagles running back to Kenny Gainwell, who plays in this Eagles run offense that is the 2nd best in the league. They literally run over 34 rushing plays per game, not in a month, per game, over 34 rushing plays, which is the 2nd most in the NFL. But Sanders, as you can see from his last 3 years, he's also missed time. He missed 5 games in 2021 and 4 games in 2020 with injury. As a somewhat smaller back out there, taking a lot of work can lead to injuries, which means Kenny Gainwell will step in. And Gainwell is off the best usage of his season. He's been splitting a lot of the work with Boston Scott, but this past week he saw his most snaps, 27 snaps, which ended up being 33% of the total share. He had his best game. He had 9 total touches. He had over 45 yards and he had 11.6 fantasy points. All of that was the best, and it's good to see that he's trending into the clear RB2 in Philadelphia. And let's not forget what Gainwell did during his time at Memphis, where guys like Antonio Gibson and Tony Pollard, these really efficient per touch players, also came from. In his last college season, he sat out the COVID year. He had over 1,400 rushing yards, over 600 receiving yards. He put up a 2,000 yard season. Not a lot of dudes are doing this. Not a lot of dudes are doing this ever in college football, and he did it just a few years ago. So stash Gainwell and then monitor this interesting situation in San Francisco. And that situation involves the rookie 3rd round pick, Tyrion Davis-Price, who looks like he's the new backup running back in San Fran, because Elijah Mitchell ended up getting injured in the last game, and according to Adam Schefter, he's going to miss 6 to 8 weeks. So they're hoping to get this guy back at best for the late playoff push. And it's very much worth mentioning that Christian McCaffrey hasn't been practicing this specific week because he also tweaked his knee, and he might be managed or limited in future games, which means that Tyrion Davis-Price will step in, and Mitchell in 2 games with Christian McCaffrey actually healthy was seeing 14 touches per game. And Price is just a fine play. Look, he had 1,000 yards in the SEC with LSU last year. That's good, but he was a surprise 3rd round pick, not on a lot of people's boards. He's not a crazy athlete. And the 49ers do have another running back in Jordan Mason, who's a nice pass catcher, undrafted free agent. Maybe he gets involved some, but earlier in the season, when Tyrion Davis-Price was healthy, he played 40% of the snaps and saw 14 carries. He actually played ahead of Jordan Mason. Now, since this time, well, McCaffrey's hurt, Elijah Mitchell Mitchell is out and Jeff Wilson is no longer on the team. So with this information, go get Tyrion Davis-Price and then add this next RB in Buffalo. And we'll get to that player in a second, but first we have to discuss Devin Singletary, who's had an elite role. He just played 78% of the snaps, and even though he only put up 9 points last week, he still saw a commanding 15 touches, 80 yards, continues to look good, and he ranks 4th in overall passing game usage, running backs routes run. Now this is a dominant role in a dominant offense, but if something happens to him, well, you're going to want his backup. And that would be the rookie second-round pick out of Georgia, the dynamic James Cook. And Cook has been working ahead of Nyheim Hines, the veteran, who they traded a 6th-round pick and Zach Moss for just a couple weeks ago. He played 10 more snaps, just 4 snaps for Hines last week to 14 for Cook. And Cook has been fantastic. He's averaging 6.7 yards per touch, top 10 in the NFL. Yeah, he's only seen 55 touches, but it's not like he's only seen 10. 55 is a good amount to stay this productive and efficient. So if Singletary misses time, I like Cook to slide in as a league winner in this Josh Allen Bills offense. And I also like Dontrell Hilliard, who we've talked about in the past, but he's arguably the best handcuff in all fantasy football. He plays behind Derrick Henry, who leads the NFL with 22.5 carries per game and is 3rd in fantasy points. And now if something happens to Henry, well, it's going to be Dontrell Hilliard who actually steps in here. Now let me give you a little bit of a background of how unlikely it was that Hilliard would still be the dude here backing up Henry. Back in March, he re-signed with this Titans team for just $1.25 million. That type of salary means you could usually get cut if they draft a rookie and the rookie looks decent. And that's exactly what the Titans did. They drafted a 4th-round rookie out of Michigan, the Big Ten, Hassan Haskins. He actually led all the running backs in bench reps, benching 27 times at the combine, which shows your strength. And that strength is a good fit for a Derrick Henry type run offense to be the backup for. But he was beat out by Hilliard, and it's hard to ignore what Dontrell is doing because he leads the NFL for the 2nd straight year in true yards per carry with 6.4 and with 7.7 yards per touch. He's that damn productive. Long story short, if Henry misses time, Hilliard steps in as a top 10 running back, in my opinion, for the fantasy playoffs. So those are handcuffs that you want, but you also want to be stashing defenses who have advantageous matchups in the fantasy playoffs, and let's discuss 3. And first off, we'll talk about the Titans, who have the 5th best playoff matchup at the defensive position. In week 16 of the playoffs, they'll get to face the Texans, who just started Kyle Allen this past week, and it wasn't good for Allen. In his first start of the season, he averaged 5.5 yards per attempt, which basically anything below 7's like the NFL average. Anything below 6 is rare. 5.5 is absolutely terrible. And to start the fantasy playoffs, they'll face the Chargers and their offensive line that has been beat up, banged up, and ranks bottom 5 in the NFL. Now, this is important because the Titans rank top 5 in pass rush and also top 5 in run defense this season. They're available in 79% of leagues right now. You should stash them if you have a deep bench because they could win you those first 2 playoff weeks. Now, the second defense worth stashing is a weird one. It's the Detroit Lions. In real life, they're terrible, but they have the best fantasy playoff matchup, and oh man, is it good. They'll start the fantasy playoffs facing Mike White, who, yeah, he just had a fantastic game, but it was against the Bears. It was a banged up Bears whole entire defense, and they're terrible this year in general. And then in the second week, he'll get Sam Darnold, who we all know Sam Darnold has not been that great over the previous seasons and does not have a good offense with a lot of playmakers at all. And then in the fantasy championship, the Lions face their division rival, the Bears, which maybe Justin Fields will be back by then, but they have the dead last ranked passing offense. And speaking of passing offenses, those 3 teams that they'll face, the Panthers, the Jets, and the Bears, are 3 of the 4 worst graded passing offenses. That's a nice spot for the Lions. And now the final team worth stashing is going to be the Los Angeles Chargers, who have the 2nd best playoff schedule. Every single week is pretty damn good. They'll face that Titans team who usually has low passing volume, who will probably be projected for like 20 or less points, and not bad. But then this big one is in week 16 against the Colts, who allow the most sacks in the NFL. And if you saw Matt Ryan on Monday Night Football, it did not look good. And then in week 17, they get the Rams, and most likely Bryce Perkins at that point, with a lack of playmakers, arguably Van Jefferson, their biggest playmaker left for the Los Angeles Rams. So those are the defenses that you want based on their playoff schedule. Now let's talk about some running backs and receivers that playoff schedule are fantastic. And let's start with running backs. And the Ravens have the 2nd easiest playoff schedule. This means you're going to want to be starting Gus Edwards in the playoffs, who just saw a season high 50% snaps, 2 times more than anybody else in week 12. You also want to be starting your Jets running backs because they have the 6th easiest matchup in the fantasy playoffs. Now, if Michael Carter is back in time, that's the guy you want to be targeting because he'll be facing the Lions, number 23 ranked run defense, to start the fantasy playoffs in week 15. And when he's healthy with Mike White in his career, he averages nearly 8 targets per game, 19.2 fantasy points per game, and nearly 20 touches per game. Now, as of right now, Carter is dealing with injury, and if it's a high ankle sprain, he's likely not going to play in the fantasy playoffs, which means their other rookie running back, not named Breece Hall, and Zonovan White, would see more usage. And in his first game as an NFL player, he had over 100 yards on 17 touches. He looked good out there and would likely be the RB1 you want to be starting, especially in week 15. And you also need to start your Bills running backs because they have the 3rd easiest fantasy schedule. And now that means you're starting Devin Singletary, but this is even more reason to be adding James Cook like we talked about earlier because his playoff schedule is so damn good. And in the fantasy championship, whether it's Devin Singletary or if he misses that game, James Cook will take on the Bears' dead last ranked run defense. Prepare right now by adding James Cook. And then understand the wide receivers who have the best matchups. And it starts with the Eagles, who have the easiest playoff schedule. Obviously, you're starting AJ Brown in the playoffs, but some of you might not know to start Devonta Smith. Here's my answer. You should. Especially in weeks 15 when they face the Bears number 28 ranked secondary, and week 17, the fantasy championship at home when they'll be facing on January 1st, the new year, the Saints 22nd ranked secondary. It was just this past week that Devonta Smith led the Eagles with 8 targets, more than AJ Brown. He's a sneaky player. Definitely play him in your flex spot. And then play your Jets wide receivers because they have the second easiest playoff schedule. They'll open up the playoffs facing the Lions number 29 ranked secondary on December 18th. This is a great spot to definitely be starting Garrett Wilson, who just broke out with Mike White, scoring over 26 fantasy points, finding the end zone, and now averages over 19 points in 4 games without Zach Wilson. But you should also consider Corey Davis, who returned from injury this past week, and he was a top 30 wide receiver in his 6 games before injury. Now, the third best matchup for the fantasy playoffs is going to be the Steelers wide receivers, and they've been interesting all season long. All of their weeks will be great. They open it up facing the Panthers number 23 ranked secondary. Then they get the Raiders 26th ranked secondary. And then in the fantasy championship in week 17, they'll face their division rival, the Ravens, who are about middle of the pack, pretty boomer bust secondary in coverage. Now, George Pickens has 10 or more fantasy points in 4 of the last 5 games, despite facing really difficult matchups. I mean, look at this murderer's row. Carlton Davis, Xavier Howard, Darius Slay. Then he had to face the Bengals' pretty solid secondary. This past week, Stephon Gilmore, who still has some in the tank. But luckily, he'll have that easy matchup down the stretch in the fantasy playoffs. And then there's Deontay Johnson, who has the weirdest situation. He ranks top 8 in targets this season, but he's not producing because he has somehow 0 touchdowns, even though he has 13 red zone targets. You should consider starting him for sure in the fantasy playoffs. And you should also acquire the Fantasy Cheat Sheet, which is my 5-step system to help you win your fantasy league and beat your buddies. It includes weekly emails with the following, as you can see here: weekly player projections, rankings, Discord access, and a whole lot more. It is just a one-time payment of $10, but the best part for you, if you don't end up winning your fantasy league for one reason or another, I'll refund it, no questions asked, that $10 right back to you. So this is risk-free. You can grab that cheat sheet that thousands of other people are currently using for this season with the link in the description below. All right, now the fifth and final thing you need to do before the fantasy playoffs is acquire Deshaun Watson, who's still available in 50% of leagues. He returns this week and he faces the Texans number 32 dead last ranked secondary. And this dude is stepping into a situation with just a ton of playmakers. We know about the backfield, the number 2 ranked run offense with Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb, but then he has Amari Cooper, who's playing like a top 10 receiver this year, a breakout candidate for the fantasy playoffs in Donovan Peoples-Jones, and arguably a top 5 tight end in the NFL right now in David Njoku, who is playing lights out this season when healthy and just got back to a full workload 80% of the snaps last week. Watson averages 23 fantasy points per game as a starter, which would rank 4th amongst all players this year. He shouldn't be on the waivers in 50% of leagues. And if you're curious, his playoff schedule, it's just fine. The Ravens are a fine matchup to open the playoffs. Week 16 against the Saints on Christmas Eve is actually a good matchup. And in the fantasy playoffs, he'll face the Commanders on the road. So he's somebody that you want to be adding, not now, but right now. And if you want to see other players that are worth an ad, especially before this week's upcoming games, to help you get over the hump and into the playoffs and improve your team, well, check out this video right here.